Welcome to another deep dive, you guys. Today we are going to unpack a story that's as old as time itself, but still shockingly relevant today. Betrayal, murder, cover-ups. It's all there, but ultimately it's a story about redemption.
Yeah, for sure.
We're taking a deep dive into 2 Samuel chapters 11 and 12, which tell the story of King David Bathsheba and the dramatic consequences of their affair.
What's fascinating is how this story, even thousands of years later, feels like it could be ripped from today's headlines. It really makes you think about human nature, the temptations of power, and the choices we make when we think no one is watching.
It's like watching a political scandal unfold in real time. But before we get to the drama, we need to set the scene. The story starts with David staying back in Jerusalem, even though his army is out at war.
And that seemingly small detail, that decision to stay behind, speaks volumes. Here's David, this legendary warrior king, choosing to stay in the comfort of his palace while his men are out risking their lives. It makes you wonder if the cracks in his character were already starting to show.
Okay, so maybe he was a little restless, maybe a little overconfident. But then comes the infamous rooftop scene where he sees Bathsheba bathing and, well, let's just say things escalate quickly.
It's like watching someone get caught in a riptide. He sends for her knowing she's married. And, ancient Hebrew law was incredibly strict about adultery.
Oh, yeah.
It was a capital offense. So David was already playing with fire.
He tries to cover up the pregnancy, even going so far as to send Bathsheba's husband Uriah to the front lines, basically setting him up to be killed.
Oh.
Talk about a slippery slope. I mean, have you ever felt yourself getting swept up in a situation like that where one bad choice leads to another, you just can't seem to stop yourself?
Absolutely. That feeling of panic trying to fix one mistake with another, it's incredibly human. And that's what makes David's story so relatable. He's not some untouchable biblical hero.
Right.
He's someone who makes terrible choices driven by desire and fear.
And then comes the prophet Nathan, who's basically tasked with calling David out on his actions. But he doesn't just go in with a direct accusation. Instead, he tells a parable, a story about a rich man who steals a poor man's lamb.
It's such a brilliant tactic. Imagine being David, hearing this story and feeling outraged at the injustice of it all. It's only when Nathan delivers that killer line, "You are the man," that David realizes he's been completely played.
And the way the text describes David's response is so raw. He doesn't try to justify himself, doesn't make excuses. It's pure, raw confession. What do you think was going through his mind in that moment?
There's a line in Psalm 51, which is traditionally attributed to David, where he says, "The sacrifices of God are a broken spirit, a broken and contrite heart. O God, you will not despise." It's about recognizing the depth of your wrongdoing, the pain you've caused, and coming before God with absolute humility.
That's such a powerful image, a broken spirit. But even though David repents, even though he experiences this profound remorse, he still faces some pretty devastating consequences. The child born to Bathsheba dies, and it really drives home the weight of his actions.
This is where the story gets really complex. The death of the child is often interpreted as divine punishment, but some scholars see it differently. They argue that the text is trying to convey a more nuanced idea about the natural consequences of our actions. We live in a world of cause and effect, and even when we repent, we can't always undo the harm we've caused.
That's such an important point. It's not about erasing the past or pretending that nothing happened. It's about acknowledging the consequences, taking responsibility, and trying to move forward in a way that leads to healing and restoration.
Exactly. And I think that's one of the most enduring lessons of David's story. It reminds us that even in the midst of tragedy, even when we've made terrible mistakes, there's still the possibility for forgiveness, for growth, for a new beginning. It's interesting how different translations handle this section of 2 Samuel.
Oh, really? How so?
Well, some versions use the word punishment when they're talking about the death of Bathsheba's first child, while others use more neutral language like consequence.
That's fascinating. It really highlights how even subtle differences in translation can shape how we understand the text.
Yeah, and it raises the question of how we interpret these ancient stories through a modern lens. I mean, what might have been considered divine punishment in the ancient world might be understood differently today.
So are you saying that we should just completely disregard traditional interpretations?
Not at all, but it's important to approach these texts with a critical eye, considering the historical and cultural context in which they were written.
That makes sense. It's like we're peeling back these layers of meaning, trying to get to the heart of what the story is really trying to tell us.
Exactly. And one of the things that's always struck me about David's story is how it just defies easy categorization.
What do you mean?
Well, on the one hand, he's this revered figure.
Yeah.
A king, a warrior, a poet even.
Yeah.
And yet he commits adultery, orchestrates a murder, betrays the trust of his people.
Yeah. He's not a simple hero or a straightforward villain.
Yeah.
He's both and either all at the same time.
Exactly. And I think that's what makes his story so relevant to us today. You know, we live in a world where we're constantly trying to categorize people,
Right.
to put them into these neat little boxes.
Right.
But real life is messy. People are complex. I mean, we're all capable of great good and terrible evil.
So true. So if we're trying to understand David as a man after God's own heart, as the text describes him, does that mean we have to excuse his behavior?
I don't think so. The text doesn't shy away from condemning David's actions. It calls him out, holds him accountable.
But it also shows us his remorse, right? His willingness to own up to his mistakes and seek forgiveness.
Right. And maybe that's the key to understanding this phrase, a man after God's own heart.
What do you think it means?
Maybe it's not about perfection or sinlessness.
Right.
Maybe it's about having a heart that's open to God, a heart that's willing to be transformed, even after we've messed up royally.
That's a really powerful idea. And it makes me think about all the times I've judged people, harshly written them off because of their mistakes.
Yeah, David's story challenges us to look beyond the surface, to see the humanity in everyone, even those who have done terrible things.
Because ultimately, we're all in need of grace and forgiveness.
Exactly.
You know, something I'm really struck by is how much this ancient story resonates with modern psychology.
Oh, absolutely. For sure.
Like I was just thinking about the concept of cognitive dissonance.
Oh, yeah.
That's where our actions don't align with our beliefs, right?
Yes, exactly. And I think we see that playing out in David's story. I mean, he knows adultery is wrong, yet he allows himself to be consumed by lust. He knows murder is a sin, yet he orchestrates Uriah's death.
It's like he's trying to rationalize his actions to convince himself that it's okay because he's the king or because he's chosen by God.
It's a classic example of how our minds can twist and turn to justify our behavior, even when we know deep down it's wrong.
And it's something we all do to some extent, right? We tell ourselves little white lies. We make excuses for our bad habits.
Yeah, it's part of being human. The key is to be aware of it, to try to catch ourselves when we're falling into those patterns of self-deception.
So David's story is a cautionary tale in that sense.
Yeah, it shows us the dangers of unchecked power, the slippery slope of rationalization, the devastating consequences of our choices.
But it also offers us a glimmer of hope. It reminds us that even when we make terrible mistakes, even when we cause immense harm, there's still a possibility for redemption.
It's never too late to own up to our wrongdoing, to seek forgiveness, to make amends.
You know, one thing that really strikes me about this whole story is how Bathsheba's voice is almost entirely missing.
Yeah, that's a good point. She's often portrayed as like a passive character, almost as just an object of David's desire.
Exactly. And we don't really get to hear her thoughts or feelings, her perspective on the whole situation.
It makes you wonder how the story might be different if it were told from her side of things, you know?
That's a fascinating thought. What do you think she might have been going through at that time?
Well, I mean, first of all, she's grieving the loss of her husband, Uriah.
Right.
And she's also carrying David's child, which must have been so complicated for her, emotionally and socially.
Absolutely. It makes you think about the whole idea of consent in this situation, too.
Right. Was she really free to say no to the king? Was she even given a real choice? You know?
And then she ends up having to marry David, the man who had her husband killed.
It's a pretty stark reminder of how women were often treated as like pawns in these power games.
And yet, even with all of that, she goes on to become the mother of Solomon, one of the most famous kings in Israelite history.
Yeah, it's almost like the story's trying to redeem her, to give her a more important place in history.
But it also kind of reminds us that even when there's tragedy and injustice, life still goes on.
And that even the people who don't have much power can still have a big impact on history.
I think you've given me a totally new way to see this story.
I'm glad to hear it. It's a story that just keeps unfolding, you know?
Yeah.
Every time you go back to it, you find something new.
As we wrap up this deep dive, I can't help but wonder if there are any modern-day stories like David's.
Oh, I'm sure there are tons.
I mean, just think of all the powerful people who have fallen from grace because of their bad choices.
Yeah. Politicians, celebrities, business leaders, they all fall prey to the same temptations.
It's like a story that never gets old. Ambition, lust, the abuse of power.
And it's a reminder that nobody's above the law, no matter how important they are or how much they've accomplished.
David's story really makes you think. It makes you question your own ideas about power, morality, redemption.
And maybe that's the most important thing we can take away from this deep dive.
That even stories that are thousands of years old can still be relevant today. They offer insights and wisdom that are still meaningful in our lives.
It's been awesome exploring this text with you.
Thanks for joining us on this deep dive. We hope it's given you some new insights and things to think about. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions, and keep diving deep into the stories that shape the world around us.